Okay, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. We are at the top of the hour. First off, I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone on the call. I know I've been chatting with a lot of you in the Q&A panel. It is wonderful to see so many familiar names. A big Happy New Year to everyone, and glad to start off this new 2019 year with a DevNet webinar. So thank you for joining, everyone, and we appreciate you giving us an hour out of your busy schedules today. So to begin, again, welcome to the fourth session of the Programmability with Cisco DevNet series. In just a minute, I will go over the sessions that we've already covered and then what we are going to cover moving forward. Once we get started and Patrick starts his actual presentation, I will also share a link in the chat window where you can go to check out, if you missed the first three sessions, you can find the slide decks and the recordings to those sessions as well. For today, though, as we are going along, as Patrick is presenting, if you can please go ahead and submit your questions to the Q&A panel. I'm going to be queuing up questions for a live Q&A at the end of today's session. If at any point you lose audio or you cannot see the slides that Patrick is sharing, please communicate with me privately via the chat window, and I will do my best to get you up and running as quickly as possible. We are recording, so a link to today's webinar will be sent out to everyone who registered for today's webinar. That takes about 24 hours for it to hit your email, so please be patient with me and I will get that recording to you as quickly as possible. At the end of today's session, you actually have to exit out of the WebEx environment for it to pop up, but there is a brief feedback survey. It is about 6 questions. If you could please take that, we would really appreciate your feedback. And as always, I'm very interested in knowing what topics y'all would like for me to get presenters for you for future sessions. So we started off back in October, and we did 2 sessions in October, Networking with Programmability is Easy and A Network Engineer in the Programmable Age. And then in November, we switched to Software-Defined Networking and Controllers. And I believe, Patrick, you were the presenter for that as well. And then today is the 4th session, Adding API Skills to Your Networking Toolbox. And just so y'all know, and this information will be in the follow-up email that I send to everyone tomorrow, but the next DevNet session is in February, and that is the new Toolbox of a Networking Engineer. So again, I will share this link in the chat window so it's easy for you to go and grab if you would like to go ahead and register for the remaining sessions. Definitely go ahead and register for the February session so you have it on your calendar. Just a quick reminder, I know we've kind of been going over this in every session, but if this is your first time joining, you still have a chance to go ahead and be a part of this raffle. But this year with this DevNet series, we are going to be raffling off a total of 15 Amazon gift cards and the amount of $25 US at the end of the series. So please note that no gift cards will be raffled off until the final 10th session is hosted, I believe, in June. 5 of these gift cards will be raffled off to those who have participated in all sessions by either attending the live sessions or viewing the recording. So this can be a mixture of the two. We know that everyone has different schedules. Some people are in class when we're holding these sessions. Some people are at work. So there is an opportunity for you to earn a Amazon gift card if you go back and watch the recordings as well. The other 10 gift cards that are going to be raffled off are going to be raffled off to everyone who participated in all of the live sessions. So if you joined us for the live session today, you're already in a good spot and you're on your way to getting your name in that raffle. Again, the certificate of participation will be available at the very end of the series. We actually don't do certificates for attending individual sessions. So again, at the very end of the series, I will share a link in the last live session. It'll also be posted on the blog, the DevNet blog for this webinar series. At that point, you can go in and you can request a certificate of participation. And it will take a little bit for us to go and check the reports. So in July, probably mid to end July, you'll get the certificate of participation for attending this webinar series. So with that, I would like to introduce everyone to Patrick. Again, if you joined session 3 back in November, his name and face should be very familiar to everyone, and he is going to be presenting to everyone adding API skills to your networking toolbox. He is a systems engineer here at Cisco Systems. And with that, Patrick, please feel free to add in anything else you'd like to share with the group before you get started to introduce yourself. And the ball is now all yours.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you. You go ahead and set up the presentation. Share. All right, let's see. Can everyone see that okay? Carrie, you got a display there?
I can see it.
Okay, perfect. And as Carrie mentioned, I do want to start off with just kind of where we've been real quick. And so we kind of set that precedence back in October that, the network engineer is changing. That role is changing. We're no longer sitting in a basement kind of keeping the lights on and making sure the printers are working. But there's more value seen across the board within the network engineering role. And so when Hank came on 2 sessions ago, he kind of mentioned as far as the skill set goes and how that skill set is kind of evolving from kind of layer 2, layer 3 functionality into some of these other pieces and parts. We talked a little bit even last month about some of the software-defined networking pieces, and as we get into more of these APIs and Python programming, all these pieces will be coming together, skills that we should know. And the last session we had was in November, and this is a touch point here that the businesses are changing, and they're seeing that the network is becoming critical to how their businesses are running, how they're maintaining their businesses, how they're getting insights back into the business itself. And in so doing, the network, as we've traditionally known it, just cannot keep up with the changes, the amount of mobile devices that are coming online, the security that's needed, IoT devices, all these management platforms, on top of all that, the complexity of troubleshooting all of those things. And so as we looked at how the business is putting pressure on the network and how these external and internal IT pressures are being put on the network, and sort of where we wanted to start. And we wanted to start with answering some of these questions that around experiences, around insights, reducing some of that complexity, and on top of everything else, the security that goes into that. So as we started looking at what this piece means, the software-defined networking piece is, at a vendor-neutral definition, it's called intent-based networking. Cisco calls it the network intuitive. It's where there's some business desires, some business goals that need to happen, and so we go to the network. The network takes those business goals and desires and translates those onto the network, and then also kind of make sure that what we want to put on the network from a hardware and software perspective is met, and that we're getting some of those insights back and fed back to us so that we can be sure the network is running the way we think it should be running. And so as we looked at Cisco's approach to some of that, we looked at the Cisco DNA Center and saw that this is where we're going to put our policies, and this is where we're going to provision and deploy our hardware and software. This is where we're going to design our network and also get some of this network health back to us so we can make sure that the wireless is running how it should, make sure that OSPF is configured as it should be. All these pieces around the Cisco DNA Center and how it's all, from that appliance there, it's able to push those changes across the entire, what we call the campus fabric, whether it's a router, a switch, a wireless LAN controller, all those pieces that come into play and report back to the appliance there. And so at the very end, we looked at, and very, very quickly touched on last time, this idea of Cisco DNA Center as a platform and what that means around some of these APIs, and we'll talk about that in great detail today, but how we're able to open up the Cisco DNA Center to allow our eco partners and how we're allowed to, we'll see some of our developers and how they can basically touch those APIs and create some interesting approaches to how we can chain those APIs together to get some really interesting insights back. Even looking at how we can chain APIs together to quickly create an SSID, to chain those together to allow ServiceNow to report a ticket open when maybe a piece of hardware has failed. Some of those things around APIs. So let's go into quickly our agenda here. We'll start with what is actually an API. So just 2 quick definitions from Wikipedia. A set of clearly defined methods of communication between various software components. Another quick definition, a way for 2 pieces of software to talk to each other. A great example that we have here, I think that can help kind of bring all this together is a lot of us have applications on our phones or devices around maybe Yelp. We want to see what restaurants are close to us. Well, Yelp did not go out and create its own mapping software to put on its application. It actually looks to and reaches out to Google Maps for its APIs to pull in and display maps to see restaurants that are close to you when you have your device. And in a very similar way, you might also have an Uber application. Uber also uses the same back-end Google Maps APIs to basically call and bring in that information back to the user so they can see what cars might be close to them. So those are some ways that APIs are being used today. And in a similar fashion, we are actually in our networking, we're using SNMP, which by its very RFC definition is designed as a programmatic interface between management applications and devices. So when we look at how switches and routers communicate back to this network management system, we actually see two pieces of hardware through software that are talking to each other. We're kind of leaving out the middleman here, the human interface. So as we look at some of this data formatting and we look at the human interface, this is a human interface we all know. It's the show IP interface brief command. And so from a sense, when we're on a CLI, we run this command, for us it is very easy for us to read, but from this API and this software piece, it's not as easy. So as we look at the way that data is formatted for these machines to take in these pieces, these API pieces, we see that it is more machine readable, still human readable, but the idea is that the data format is changing a little bit. Instead of just being strictly for humans, we now want to bring it in so that we can start to utilize when we send requests and get responses back, how these pieces of software can talk to each other. Some common types of data formatting, just like we saw on the last slide, is kind of in that mustard box there, is that JSON formatting, one of the data formats. There's also XML in the blue box, as well as YAML. Now, all these you can see, as you look at them, they all have basically the same piece of information, just formatted slightly differently. So as these APIs are talking to each other, and again, when APIs are talking to each other, it is in a raw text format across a TCP/IP connection. So nothing too magical here, but just as this text goes back and forth, the machines need to know how to ingest that and what they expect back. But as you can see here, based on these three data formats, other than the way that maybe some are using curly braces in JSON, or maybe some tagging in XML, or even some spacing that's required around YAML, the basic information is indeed there. And that's based on, again, just some key value pairs, right? So again, we see here that in this green text here is a key. And the key is a unique identifier based on that type of data, and it's going to be on the left side of a colon, especially as we look at, again, some of that JSON code. And on the right is a value, something that is going to be either a string or integer, a list. It can be a Boolean, a true, false. So that's kind of how we want to look at some of these data formats that come back to us. I want to dive a little bit deeper into JSON, just JavaScript object notation, because it seems to be one of the more popular data formats that's out there and being used across the board. But again, the idea is that it is human readable, but also kind of in the API framework, it can be read, it can be changed, manipulated. And so we see, even as we look at this particular piece of JSON code here, that the object itself is sort of put in between these curly braces, and then we can also have lists, and we'll see those in sort of those bracket formats. But even one of the things that kind of confused me the first time I saw something like this was, if you look at that first line, that IETF-interfaces::interface, that's all in quotes. So the first time I kind of looked at it, I was a little confused if that's actually a key and a value. It's actually not. If it's all in quotes, that represents everything to the left of the colon. So all of that whole line is the key, and then the value, as you see here, is another object that has the name, description, enabled, and even some of the IP addressing around that value. Again, in JSON, white space is not as significant. So sometimes when you have that displayed, and we may look at some different ways to display that, when it comes back, it may not look as pretty as this. There are a lot of programs that will kind of pretty it up like this, but white space is not significant in JSON data formats. So again, like we said, each object is going to be surrounded by those curly braces. And again, they're separated around those commas. So you can kind of see that name, colon, gigabit Ethernet 2, and there's a comma after it. That means there's another key value pair to come within that object. And again, as we look at the JSON list, right, so here's basically a list of addresses that we might see For instance, if we have on one of our devices, we might have a primary IP address and 2 secondary IP addresses. JSON can display that as well using the brackets and separated by commas. Let's move on to actually what REST APIs are and what they are. So as we said before, within APIs, we are basically sending out a request, this text that goes out, we're requesting some information or requesting to put some information out there, and we're going to get a response back. Again, that response is more text coming across this TCP/IP connection. As we look specifically at what REST is, REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and it's built on the HTTP framework. So a quick way to think about this is as you go to a website like Cisco.com, when you get that's when you're requesting information. You want to get a web page, and what comes back to you, hopefully, is that web page. And so that's a very similar framework as how REST is working. That you're going to go request a particular piece of API data, and it's going to display back to you. It's not going to display as a web page, but it's going to display that text back to you. So again, it's become more and more popular just because it is easy to use and it's very simple to use because it is based on a protocol that we already are very familiar with. And as a matter of fact, if we look at this particular, what they call the URI, this Uniform Resource Identifier, we can already see a lot of similarities here to what we would consider a URL, right? In blue, we see we're calling a server just like we would, a www.cisco.com. We are looking at in the green there a resource, so a directory within that server that we're going to get that information from. And in the red, we have some parameters, something we might be filtering on to get a specific piece of information we're looking for. Some of these methods that we want to look at here include what they're called kind of this CRUD method, this create, read, update, and delete. And so as we look at some of the calls we're going to make, we will make a post call to create something. And in this example, it's kind of around a library, right? So if we're posting information, we're creating a new book within that library. We might get or read a particular list of books from a library. We might be putting information or updating information. We might be saying who the borrower is from that particular book. And then we have a patch, which might be changing just a particular piece of information around an author of a book. And then also delete is just what it says, deleting maybe a book from a library. Now, when we send these methods, a lot like what happens when we are looking at web pages, if we type in a web page that may not exist, we have seen in the past, that web browser come back with a 404 file not found error. So in a similar way, when we call these REST APIs, we're going to get some status codes back. And typically, anything in the 200 range is a good thing. It means that it's come back well, and that everything is good with the information that we should be getting back. We might see, however, something in the 400 range. Like I said, the 404 not found, or it might be a 401 error that describes maybe we're not authorized or may not have the right authentication to get into that particular data. Or it might be a 403 that we are indeed have the authorization, but it might be just forbidden from the other side to get it to look at that information. The other status codes would be 500. That would have to do with some server side errors. So let's look here at some headers. And so when we think about REST APIs, we're going to look at two sections, right? Headers as well as the actual data that's being sent. So when we look at headers, we might request a certain data format, like we looked at before. We might want to request JSON or XML or some other data format. This is where we can, within our headers, kind of look at that and say, this is what I would like back, or even say from the response side, this is what I'm sending you, and this is the format you should expect. Again, this is also a place where we might have some authorization, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, as well as basically some date time stamping that will go on as those requests and responses go back and forth. As far as data, it's again, this is on the right side, a very simple JSON type of data that has come back with those key value pairs, again separated by commas and within those curly braces like we talked about. But this is sort of just a snapshot of what some of that data might look like after the headers go back and forth. Let me quickly touch on some of the authentication pieces. So the first one is basically none, where it may be an API that's completely open and public, and we'll look at some of those in some demo examples we'll do together. And then right after that is some basic HTTP authentication. A username and password gets encoded and then sent to that service that we're trying to access. Usually that's tied with the next one, which is a token. So what we would do is basically send out a username and password, and then what we might get in response to that is a particular token or service ticket, it's sometimes called, so that future calls we make to that device would use the token, which is a little more secure than just using the encoded string. And the last one is OAuth, basically where we're using allowing users to authorize access on another's behalf. So a good example of that, if you have registered, and hope you have registered at developer.cisco.com, there are a number of methods to sign in there. You don't actually create an account at developer.cisco.com. You would see if you did a login there that you might see you can log in through GitHub or through Google or Facebook, a number of other methods, and basically it's a third-party way for setting up a client ID and a client authorization to allow that to pass as a third party. Real quick, I've gone fairly fast through these couple slides, and before we get into examples, I just want to take a pause real quick and see if there's any questions that are out there right now.
Patrick, I believe you are good to go for now.
Okay.
But again, just a reminder, everyone, if you have questions over anything that Patrick is presenting today, please go ahead and start submitting those in the Q&A. The sooner you start submitting the questions, hopefully the more questions that we can answer for you guys today on the call.
Great, thank you. So this is one that, if you have seen, I believe it's session 2 with Hank Preston. Hank loves to call out this Internet Chuck Norris database. It is an open API. It doesn't require any authorization. But the first kind of tool that we can use to call these APIs is this curl tool, which is basically a command line tool. I believe I've tested on Windows 10 as well. There's always some question around if Windows 10 has this. I believe it is built in, at least the version I had, it was built in to Windows 10, but it can be used on a Linux system and Mac as well. And by using this curl command line, we can basically are calling out to this API that's basically just essentially a database of, no clever name here, Chuck Norris jokes. But you can see here from the first one, it's just we're calling a random joke, and then the second curl command we're calling out here actually uses that parameter that we were talking about, that question mark limit to nerdy, so we can actually get a specific category that's based within this database of jokes. So we're actually getting back a particular, in this way, this nerdy category joke back. So we'll do this one when we get to the next tool we talk about. But I do want to also point out that we can, as far as the network programmability goes, RESTCONF is basically a standard that was ratified in 2017, and you'll start to see it more and more on Cisco's hardware, software platforms, the iOS XE platform as well. And I believe it's in 2 sessions from now, we'll get more into the under the hood on RESTCONF. I just wanted to point out that here you can kind of see on that blue line as we run through this curl, and the backslash is basically looking at it so it breaks it up in a couple lines to make it easier to read. But basically on that blue section, that's where we're calling out a username and password. And then in sort of that green color, we're looking at some of the header pieces that we want, information, data that we want to accept back. And then on the last line, we're actually calling out to this particular device, and we're asking for information around Gigabit Ethernet 2. And so you see below that, you see these greater than signs. All of those are part of the header that's being sent out, the request header that's being sent out. Those are the header pieces that we see there, the GET request and then some other accept information, some authorization information like we talked about, that encoded string of username and password, that's being sent across the header. Then when we get a response back, everything on the left side of the screen with these less than signs, if you will, those are the headers that come back. There's that 200 OK. That's a good status code. It means things went well. We get our timestamp. We get the content type back, what is going to be displayed in the data, which is on the right-hand side of the response. And as you can see, we requested information on the previous slide about Gigabit Ethernet 2, and this is the information that we're getting back. Right? Similar structure to what we've seen in the past. This JSON code that gives us the name, gives it maybe if there's a description on the interface, whether it's enabled or not, and then some basic IP information about it. So we kind of looked at this curl tool, and that, again, this is a command line way to interact with APIs. But I also want to point out, and one that we're about to use quite a bit, is Postman, and that's basically a GUI tool that's going to allow us to go through and look further at some of these API calls. And as you start to put some of these pieces together, you're probably going to put them in a script. And again, Python is a great coding language that we like to use at Cisco, and especially in the DevNet group. And there's a library that kind of surrounds how to make those API calls, and that library is called requests. But something I also want to point out, just as you start to grasp the overall concept of APIs, again, raw text being passed back and forth across that connection. Also, you want to look at some of the way that the dynamic API documentation might be. And again, what that means is that as you call an API, you kind of want to look at the documentation and make sure you're formatting it correctly, make sure you haven't missed any pieces around some of the authentication and some of the structure that they have built around those APIs. There are also, I'll call out in Firefox and Chrome at least, there are also some developer tools that you can use within those browsers to help you kind of look at those different pieces under the hood as those API calls are being passed back and forth. So let's go look at Postman. Again, Postman is a great, simple API client. And so this is a good place for me to pause as you guys go into this website. If you don't already have it, just go ahead and grab it. And what I'll do in the next couple of slides is kind of walk through the interface. But if you go to getpostman.com and download it on your machines, we can go through some of these together. And my goal would be to give you guys some URIs to try yourself to make sure you're getting the same response as I am. But also, I will pause one more time because I do see maybe some questions coming in. I'm not sure. But I'll pause again to see if there are any.
Yes, Patrick, there's a few. So someone would like to know if the curl command is used only for API requests. No,
it could be used. It's just a general tool that is a command line tool, but it's a nice tool for API requests. But it's very powerful. It can do a lot of other things as well.
And I know you just said that you and DevNet, you like to use Python, but is Python programming required for REST APIs?
No, it's not. But again, because DevNet Cisco does use Python quite a bit, it's an easy tool, and a lot of the DevNet developers use Python already. So that's one I'd just like to call out. That as we start to go into this programmable age of networking, it just makes if you already know Python, it makes it that much easier to get into those spaces. And if not, Python is fairly easy to pick up, and there's a lot of resources around that as well. And I think next week, as we get more into Python, there may be some additional resources there that the speaker can call out.
Thanks, Patrick. And then there was one more. So a student has commented that they've done all the webinars so far and done the learning tracks from DevNet. They were wondering if there is any course or training in depth related to APIs and Generator, more specific in the collaboration side, that you could recommend.
Yeah, so on the collaboration side, I think where you're going to see the most APIs would be around the WebEx Teams application that Cisco has, because there are a lot of under-the-hood ways that WebEx Teams can make those API calls and do different things in calling the APIs, even from a Cisco DNA Center perspective, or some of the other Meraki APIs. So those pieces can definitely be tied into WebEx Teams. I know that there's a couple of Cisco live sessions around. I think if you just do a search for WebEx Teams API, or just even API under the CiscoLive.com website, you'll see a lot of good information there, because there are definitely ways to tie in with different pieces and different webhooks and bots to make those calls in WebEx Teams. And I believe also there was, and Stuart can correct me if I'm wrong here, but some of that Net DevOps Live that Hank Preston had done a series on, one of them I believe was around using WebEx Teams to make some of those API calls.
if I can also hijack just 2 seconds, Patrick, from your time. So
sure.
As the Networking Academy also has 2 workshops. One of them is about WebEx Teams.
That's right.
So you should be able to access this because you're all Networking Academy folks on this. So check the couple of URLs that we have. We'll post this on the chat, and you'll be able to get those and register and take those on also. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No sorries at all. Joseph, if you want maybe to post those in the chat, just so that there's a quick link so that people can find them, that'd be great. But I do want to call out real quick while we're all getting our Postman installed is thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Joseph, both for joining as panelists today to kind of field some of those questions. All right. I'll move on then. So hopefully, at least for most of us, we have Postman installed now. And I'll kind of walk you through the basic interface here. So as we look and launch that, you'll probably won't see all of this text, but I just want to call out some of the pieces here. Is that when we do just like we do with the curl tool, we'll put in that URI or URL in the sense of as we used to with the URL with the web browser. We do URI with APIs. Looks the same pretty much, but we'll call out that address here in that box and what method we're using. And so this is where we have that drop-down box where we have get, put, post. All those pieces are here depending on what we're trying to do, whether we're trying to create, read, update, etc. Here we have some of the ways that we can look at the headers that might be going through. And then when we look at those pieces, we may also want to call out the type of information we want to accept as part of those headers. And what's nice about this is as we look at that value and start typing in the word application, it'll start auto-filling so we can kind of see application JSON or application XML, those kind of those pieces of the data we want to accept back. And then we just hit that blue button to send the request. And once that request is sent, we hopefully will see this status 200 for OK, everything went through well. Again, we'll be able to see headers that came back from the response as well as the actual body of the text that we would expect to receive back. We do the same thing with a post. In this case, we're looking at a post in terms of we're sending information up. In this case, a username and password to and this is the APIC EM software-defined controller from Cisco. It is depreciated, but it's still up in the sandbox, so you can still play with the APIs there. And then so we're sending that up to get back, as you see below there, a service ticket. And so as we look at those different pieces, I'll go through again, and we'll look at some quick ways how we can help with some of those tokens and those service tickets as we go back and forth. One really nice thing I'll call out here is that as you're working with APIs, Postman has a great way to create collections. So it's basically a folder structure that if you have 5 or 6 different calls that you're making to the same controller, you can kind of put those in a folder and make a collection around them. So different pieces, like we said, we may have to post first to get our token back, and then once we have our token, we can do some other get pieces, whether we're displaying network devices or other pieces of that controller. Another thing we can do is through our environmental variables. So Postman has a great way to say, you know what, maybe you do have a collection of calls that you want to make to a controller. Maybe that controller is on your network and the IP needs to change, or you have to change a username or password. And so to go through all those different API calls within a collection or otherwise, it's time consuming, but there's a way that we can basically use Postman and have these double curly braces around different pieces that basically turn those into variables. And we turn those into variables, like I said, we can create those environmental variables as well, which again is just another nice way to not have to go everywhere to change something, just kind of always is looking back to those environmental variables. So as we see here in this case, in this environment, we've called out the different pieces, whether it's the URI or the username and password, and it's going to basically translate that for us. There is one other piece that I'll call out that's really nice, and it has to do with, again, the way that we are trying to get that token back. And as we said, a token is a short-lived token. So oftentimes we have to reach out again and do another post with a username and password to get a new token so that we can do these other API calls that we want to do. Also, what's nice about Postman is that we can, this little short JavaScript piece here under one of the test headers allows us, and you can, within these slides, you'll be able to copy this piece down, but basically what this little JavaScript is doing is saying, what I want to do is when I get this service ticket back, I want to then create a variable called token. And I want to put that variable token within my environmental variables, so the next time I have to make a call, the token's already there. So just another nice way to look at to Postman in that respect. And then lastly, what's nice about Postman is as we get in, even like I said, even to the next session, as we're starting to put some of these pieces together, is around coding. So there's actually a code button within Postman that allows us to turn these API calls that we're making actually into code. And again, there's multiple types of code that are supported within Postman. Again, Cisco leans a little more towards the Python side, but there are other programming languages available. And so this is basically what you're seeing here is a display of taking one of our API calls to the APKM and turning it into Python code, and with a little bit of massaging, not too much, we actually have a piece of code that we can then copy and put into a larger Python script. So I want to quickly do some demos for you. See here. Postman. Let's see here. Let me know when you guys can see my Postman screen. Okay. So again, this is Postman. By default, it does show up as kind of a white background. I just changed mine to kind of a dark mode. But essentially, the very first URI, let's see if I can copy this into our chat to everyone, is that URI there. So this is, again, going back to, these Chuck Norris database, right? So essentially that's our URI, and we're going to make sure that this is a get. You can see the other ones are there, post, put, patch, they're all there. We want to get the information from this URI. I went ahead and put a parameter on there to just limit some nerdy jokes. And then if I just hit send here, what I should be getting back at the bottom of the screen is that data back. That's the body, that's the data. There's also, we can look at headers as well as some of the other pieces that have come back. But essentially, this is the way we want to see the body of the text. We want to see the data come back. Again, you can do the raw format or the pretty format. Normally, it would come back as raw, but again, Postman allows it to kind of pretty it up based on the curly braces and some of the formatting. Again, within JSON data format, white space doesn't matter, but it's just a way to make it a little more human readable. And we get our joke back. So that's kind of one of the more simple ones, but I want you guys all just to take a moment to go into the chat window, copy that in there, paste it in the URI, make sure it says get, and just hit send and make sure that you're getting the response back. And that's pretty much your first API call if you haven't already made one. Another one that I like to call out is this deck of cards API. And again, you don't have to worry about remembering all these URIs right now. I do have them, when we get back to the deck, I do have them in part of our resources for later. But I'll go ahead and post that one as well. So if you run that one, you'll get something very short back. It would just get this kind of, the only thing that really is here is this deck ID, because then you can basically turn around and use that deck ID to, in this case, is basically drawing a count of 3 cards. And so all of this, how do I know how to do this? How do I know that this is how it's to be formatted? It's because when you go to the deckofcardsapi.com webpage, it will give that documentation. Here's how to get that shuffled deck for the first time. Here's where you need to put in that deck ID and how you can draw 3 cards. So all those pieces are part of the documentation. So as you look at those pieces of documentation, you can kind of see up here at the top, and in red, that's because this is a variable based on the variable that I've chosen from my deck ID. Now, the easy way to do it is once you get your deck ID, you can go in here and copy and paste it into where it says deck ID here at the top. That'll do the same thing for your deck. But you see again at the bottom, the data is coming back, right? This 4 of diamonds or 3 of hearts. Those pieces are just basically coming back because I've called that through the API and used that deck ID, my own unique ID, to draw 3 cards. And so again, all that's based on the documentation. The next one is, let's flip over here real quick, is some other documentation that I want to show. around a holiday API. So make sure I'm sharing this. So again, this website, again, you don't have to type it down quickly, but this is a public APIs website. It has a whole index of different APIs that you can go look at. If it has authorization, if it doesn't, what it does. And so I put this also in for reference so that you can just go and play with some of these APIs. One of them I found was a public holiday API, which essentially, again, this is part of their documentation on their web page. Is how to format this API, and then basically you put in the country code of your choice along with the year. So when I go back to Postman, you can see up here I just put in US for the country code in the year 2019. I'll go ahead and put that in the chat window as well. So that when I made that GET call, again, URI, make sure it says GET, hit send, and in the body of the text comes back all of the holidays around the United States. One application, I was just thinking in terms of being a network engineer, sometimes you may or may not, depending on the company you work for, may be allowed or not allowed to do certain changes or certain ways of operating your particular network based on whether it's a holiday or not. Some people don't like to do it because with a holiday schedule, there's limited staff, so certain things you may not want to do, make changes on those days. And other people say, no, do them on the holidays because no one's using the service is being limited, or not a lot of people are using it. But again, just as we look at the ways that APIs can start to be chained together, you can go to this API and figure out, hey, does that match up with a particular holiday based on this particular year's calendar? And again, it does have to be the United States. That particular API does pretty much for all countries. Another one that I found that was within that API list was this one here, which is basically an API around IP addressing, so that you can get a country that API's or that IP is from, that IP address, what city it's from, the region. So all those pieces come into play around this particular API call. And so at the very bottom here, it even has a nice button for API documentation. So that when you click on that, it basically opens up. You can see several ways to call that API. They have it up here at the top, curl, and there's the curl command right here, and how to call that API. If you run it in Ruby, here's the way to do it in Ruby. Here's the way to do it in Python. So this particular API documentation is very good around how to run this based on whether you're using a programming language or if you just want to use curl. In this case, I just took this particular URI and I put it back into Postman. I'll put that one in the chat as well. And again, just with the GET and that particular URI and send, I'm able to see information about that particular IP address. And the last but not least, I did a call, and this is where I kind of use my environmental variables around our sandbox Cisco DNA Center controller, so that when I look at, I can use this I right here to see the environmental variables that are created already. So anytime you have those double curly braces for DNAC, then that's going to the sandbox, dnac.cisco.com. There's a port called out here, so it's using port 443. And then there's also some pieces around username and password. So when I make this particular call, I'm going to get a token back. And this is when I use the test piece here to say, once you get that token back, create a variable called token. And when you do that, and you make the next call, you can see that now I have some information around this Cisco DNA Center controller of what devices are there. So I do, again, want to point out, this is important, I think, to mention again. I'm going to go over to our DNA Center controller and make sure you guys see that. And this, again, this Cisco DNA Center controller is a sandbox, so that's the sandbox dnac.cisco.com. But there's this part called platform. This is what we've been talking about. And under developer tools, we're going to see this APIs, right? So these are all the APIs that Cisco has opened on their Cisco DNA Center. But the one that I ran in Postman actually is under devices. And it's this one here, get device list. So when I click on this particular link, it's going to tell me a little more about it. It's going to show me the URL or URI and then the method is the get method. And within this documentation, and this also applies if you're looking at the APIC EM controller, but you can go try it out. You can basically say, you have parameters if you want to put them in. If you don't, that's fine. These aren't required parameters. But if you run it, you'll see here it's kind of squished at the bottom, but you're basically going to see the same two devices that I pulled up and requested and got the response for in Postman. So this is a way to test, and a lot of, depending on how the documentation is written, especially within Cisco, you have the ability to try out those APIs within the controller. And then, like I said, you can also see how it should be designed through the URL URI. And that's essentially what we have up here. Now, again, I used environmental variables, but that's the same basic function. So what's nice about this is that now that I have, and again, you may have more than 2 devices on your network, probably do. But what's nice about this is, as I'm looking at all my devices from the controller, I'm able to pull all of them into, and again, this is Postman, and we'll get later on to looking at some different pieces around coding. But even right now, even as I've just made this call and pulled in all my network devices, let's say Cisco releases and says, hey, there was a security bug that we found under software version 16.5. Well, by pulling in all my devices, even here, I can see that one of the pieces that's going to be displayed back in my JSON code is software version. So now I have a way to quickly look at each device and see what software version they're running. So again, a great way to not have to touch every physical device, every router, every switch, but now I can have a central place to pull in all of my devices and quickly look through here and see what, in this case, what software version it's running. And again, what's nice about this is up here, you can see right here, there's this word code. And as I look at code, I can see that depending on how I want to bring that in, depending on what programming language I might be running, I can quickly pull that in and have a nice little bit of code that I might want to copy to the clipboard and massage it a little bit, like I said, to make sure it's how I want to display or however I want to look at it. But now I have a way to take it to the next level, which essentially is what even the next session we'll be talking about in terms of taking these pieces and putting them together to make some nice Python scripts so that we can go out and do some further pieces around programmability on the network. Let me, I'll pause again while I switch back over to the slide deck to see if there are any questions up to this point.
Patrick, unless I am missing something, I think that we are all caught up. It is so helpful having 3 other people here to help answer questions in the Q&A.
Yes, thank you again all for doing that. All right.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything new. Unless, Wadi, you see something I'm not seeing, I think we are good.
We're good.
Okay, thank you. So just in summary, we kind of went through what an API is, and again, very simply put, raw text going back and forth again across a TCP/IP connection. And then as we looked at some of these REST APIs, and the main thing around looking at REST APIs and how to make sure that you're making the right calls is to look at that documentation. And as you look at that documentation and start getting familiar with Postman and just, again, just a great GUI way to look at these calls that are going back and forth, the request and response back, and then basically taking that, and now you can see how that body's coming back in, and then also a way to take it to the next level and start to create your code around that. And so as a kind of, again, some resource and starting points, I mentioned here just some of the sandboxes we have. And again, the calls that we were looking at were from the Cisco DNA Center sandbox. There's also an APIC EM sandbox if you want to take a look at that as well. I mentioned here just some Postman collections that you may want to bring into your Postman environment that you can start to look at and to play with those as well. Some of the other ones that we looked at, just the Check Norris database, Deck of Cards API, this free API public repository, so you can kind of see some other API calls that you might want to make and to look at. And then also just mentioned some Cisco Live sessions that I thought were nice around, again, just sort of reiterating APIs, REST APIs, and also how the Cisco DNA Center works as this API platform. So that's the end of my deck. And again, if you have any questions directed towards me, again, at the beginning of the session, I do have my Twitter tag there. So if you need to reach out and find me and ask questions, feel free to do so. But having said that, Carol, that's kind of as you mentioned, sort of the live Q&A time.
You got it. Thank you so much, Patrick. So far, there's been about a handful of students that have contacted me in the chat window privately, and they really loved this session with the demos. So thank you, Patrick, so much.
Absolutely.
So with that, everyone, I know that we've, thank goodness for the 3 people answering questions and helping me out in the Q&A. I know we've answered some questions, but again, we do have about 10 minutes or so. So if anyone else has any other questions for Patrick, we'll be hanging around for about 10 minutes to answer questions. And again, please put those in the Q&A panel so we can call those out to Patrick.
There's one question all the way at the end from Victor, if Patrick wants to answer that one.
Okay, Patrick, I don't know if you can find it. It says, thanks for presenting us the APIs tutorial in Postman and Python with request library. Now the question, is there a way to check when the data was modified or when the JSON data was created, updated? He's thinking about an integrity script.
So as far as those pieces, and let me go back over here and see if we can look at some of the calls we've made. But in the headers, and again, this is part of what the headers, I don't know if you can see that. Let me make sure. Can you see my Postman screen right now?
Yep.
You can? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me, okay, Postman. So within the headers, as we're making these requests and getting responses back, you see within those headers there's always kind of this date timestamp field. So as far as just looking at the ways to look at integrity, you kind of see when that request went out, and you can also see when the response was. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that is one way to check, is through the kind of that date field within the headers.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. And because a few of you are asking, I'm going to go ahead and answer this verbally. The resources list that Patrick shared, I most definitely will include those links on the follow-up email. And again, I'm going to put the Programmability with DevNet webinar series blog in the chat window, so it'll be at the bottom. If you want to go grab that, that is where the slides will eventually be posted as well. I say eventually because, again, it'll take about 24 hours for the recording and the slide deck to post there. So please bear with us. We post those as soon as possible, but again, those will be shared in 2 different places, in the follow-up email and then on that series blog. Thank you for putting that together, Patrick, the resources list.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And the blog link is going in there now.
I see one more question that has come in around, is Postman only intended for web apps? That's kind of what I use it for. I think that's what a lot of DevNet uses it for, to help with some of those APIs around the controllers and some of the Meraki APIs. I think it is more powerful than just around those pieces, but I personally have not delved into it further than that. One other request or question I normally get is around, how do you turn dark mode on? If you haven't seen it already, there's this settings button. Where do the settings go? That usually, or preferences, I should say, that allows you to turn themes dark mode. So if you guys are looking for that, it's under the settings, but you can go, from either one, light or dark. Again, I prefer dark because I think it's easier to see when you're doing something like this in a presentation, but whatever your preference.
Thanks, Patrick. And then there is a question, how can we get on with DevNet on GitHub? You mean as maybe just a clarification, you mean as far as the repository that I sent? If it's in terms of that particular GitHub repository, that should be publicly available, if that's the question as I understand it.
Otherwise, if it's around just getting on DevNet's site in general, if you go to developer.cisco.com, like I mentioned, there's several ways to sign in, either through Google or Facebook, or even if you have a GitHub account, it can link to that as well. Maybe that was the question.
Thanks, Patrick.
Awesome.
I just put a link in the chat window too, as well, for the DevNet community.
Okay.
All right, I don't see any other questions at the moment. I do want to take this time, everyone, just to remind everyone that the next session, the 5th session of this webinar series, will be hosted on February 13th, and the title of that is The New Toolbox of a Networking Engineer. So again, February 13th, and it starts at the same time that today's webinar started, at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And again, the link to the blog is in the chat window several times. If y'all can go and grab that, it's a perfect place to find all information for this webinar series. Past recordings, past slide decks, that's where today's slide deck and recording will be eventually posted, and you can register for the next 2 DevNet sessions as well. All right. Well, Patrick, I know we just have a few minutes left. I don't see any questions, so I am going to go ahead and close it out, and I will hang out for a few more minutes. But again, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We know that everyone has busy schedules, so we really appreciate you taking your time to come and join the live session. It's always wonderful getting to chat and get to know each of you a little bit better in the chat and Q&A windows. And again, we really hope to see you on February 13th. And again, everyone, just have a wonderful rest of your day, your afternoon or evening, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon. Thank you, Patrick, for a great presentation. And thank you to Swazi and Joseph for answering questions.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Stuart.